My name is Tom. I'm not really one for ghost stories or weird tales, but this happened to me a few winters ago, and it's haunted me ever since. I'd been on a trip with some friends in the mountains. One night, a heavy snowstorm hit, and we were forced to take shelter in a small lodge. We had enough food and warmth, but on the third day, I started getting restless. I'm used to the cold, having grown up in Canada, so I figured I'd hike around a bit to stretch my legs and clear my head. The lodge keeper warned me not to wander too far. "Storms come quick here," he said with a frown. "And if you're out there when the next one hits, you won't be coming back." I laughed it off, promised I wouldn't go far, and bundled up for the cold. I walked for about an hour, following an old snow-covered trail. The air was crisp, the sky gray and thick with clouds, but there was a peaceful quiet in the woods. Then I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a village, or at least the outline of one. Several houses all clustered together, half buried in snow. There were no signs of life. No footprints, no smoke from chimneys, no lights in the windows. Just rows of wooden houses standing silent under layers of white snow. Curious, I decided to investigate. I walked up to the first house, a small cabin with a slanted roof and a half-broken door hanging loosely from its hinges. I peered inside, empty. Dust hung in the air, and snow had drifted in through broken windows. Old furniture sat untouched, as though whoever had lived there had just left. I checked a few more houses, and it was the same story in each one. They were all deserted. There were cups on tables, clothes hanging on hooks, toys scattered on floors, all untouched. It was like everyone had vanished without a trace. Then I saw the footprints. They were fresh, imprinted in the soft snow right in the middle of the village. 2 trails, leading from one of the houses to the edge of the woods. I felt a chill run down my spine, despite the heavy coat I was wearing. I hadn't seen anyone around, and the village had looked completely undisturbed before. But now I wasn't alone. I followed the footprints cautiously, each step sinking deeper into the snow. The prints were small, almost child-sized, leading toward a clearing just beyond the last house. My breath fogged up in front of me, my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I moved forward. In the clearing, the footprints ended abruptly. And there, standing in the center of the clearing, was a small doll. Its face was pale, eyes wide, and it wore a tiny dress covered in frost. It was old, and yet it looked as if someone had just placed it there. I bent down to pick it up, brushing the snow from its face, feeling the rough fabric of its dress under my gloves. The silence around me was so thick, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then, behind me, I heard a soft crunch in the snow. I whipped around, but there was no one there, just the houses, silent and dark, and the snow-covered trail I'd walked to get there. But the feeling was unmistakable. I was being watched. With the doll still in my hand, I started backing away, carefully retracing my steps. That's when I noticed something else. My footsteps, my own, clear prints in the snow, had disappeared. I looked down, blinking, my pulse racing. They were gone, covered as if a fresh blanket of snow had fallen over them in seconds. Panic bubbled up inside me. I dropped the doll and turned, running as fast as I could back to the path I had come from. The village seemed to stretch out, each house looking the same as the last, and it felt like I was moving in circles, unable to find my way out. The silence pressed in around me, heavy and suffocating. My chest ached, my legs burned, but I didn't stop. After what felt like hours, I stumbled out of the village and back onto the trail. I looked over my shoulder once, and I swear, in one of the cabin windows, I saw a faint, pale face staring back at me. Just watching, as if curious. I didn't wait to get a closer look. I ran all the way back to the lodge, where my friends and the lodge keeper were waiting. They could see the fear on my face, and they asked what had happened. I told them about the village, the houses, the doll, and the footsteps that had vanished. The lodge keeper grew pale. He nodded slowly and said, "You found the Village of Silence. The story goes that a plague came there long ago, and the villagers abandoned it. But the spirits, they say some never left, and anyone who stumbles on that place is never really alone." I never went back to that part of the mountain again, And every winter, when I see the first snowfall, I think of that pale face in the window and wonder if someday it'll come looking for Emmy. I thought that was the end of it, a strange encounter that would just haunt my dreams every now and then. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was left unfinished. Sometimes at night I'd lie awake replaying the moment I saw that pale face in the window, wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed just a little longer, if I'd tried to find out who or what was in that village. Months passed, and winter came around again. I found myself thinking of the Village of Silence more and more. One night, unable to ignore the pull any longer, I decided I'd go back and see it once more. I told myself I was going to prove it had just been an illusion, maybe a trick of the storm or my mind playing games, but part of me knew I was lying. Deep down, I wanted to know what I'd really seen. So I packed my gear, made the drive up to the mountains, and checked into the same lodge. The lodge keeper, the same old man as before, watched me with wary eyes as I unpacked, his mouth a tight line of disapproval. Finally, he spoke up. "You're going back there, aren't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, trying to play it off with a laugh, but he didn't laugh back. Instead, he told me a story I hadn't heard before. Long ago, he said, a strange illness swept through the village, a sickness that drove people mad with fever and strange visions before it took their lives. The villagers tried to escape, but those who left the village quickly vanished in the wilderness, one by one. Eventually, they say, a final snowstorm buried the town and sealed it off from the world. From that day on, anyone who stumbled upon Frosthaven locals now called it the Village of Silence, either went mad themselves or simply never returned. I brushed it off, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't joking. "Mark my words," he said, gripping my shoulder. "Don't stay after dark." I set out the next morning, and soon enough, the village appeared on the horizon just as I remembered it. Everything looked just as it had before: the snow-covered houses, the empty windows, the silence so deep it felt like sound had never existed there. I walked between the cabins, feeling that same eerie quiet wrap around me. I tried to tell myself it was just an empty, forgotten place, that it was all in my head. But then, I saw them again, those same child-sized footprints, leading from the middle of the village toward the woods. This time, I didn't follow them. I couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been left for me to find, like whoever left them was leading me somewhere. So instead, I went back to the house where I'd seen the pale face in the window. The door hung half open, creaking in the breeze, as if waiting for me. Inside, the room was dark and cold. A layer of frost covered everything, from the chairs to the table, even the walls. I walked in slowly, my breath fogging the air in front of me. And there, in the middle of the room, sat the doll I'd seen before. I didn't touch it this time. Instead, I noticed something else: a thin trail of snow, leading from the doll up the narrow staircase to the second floor. My heart pounded, but I couldn't stop myself. I felt pulled, like there was some invisible force guiding me up the steps. They creaked under my weight, and with each step the air grew colder, until my breath turned to tiny ice crystals. At the top of the stairs, I saw a door slightly ajar, leading to a small bedroom. I reached out, pushed it open, and froze. A young girl stood in the center of the room, facing away from me. Her pale skin and white dress blended with the frost-covered walls, almost as if she were a ghost made of snow. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just stood there, her back turned, as if waiting. My hand started to shake, but I managed to whisper, "Hello." Slowly, she turned her head to look at me. Her face was as pale as death, her eyes hollow and dark, and yet there was something sad in her expression. She looked at me for what felt like an eternity, her gaze cold and distant, as though seeing right through me. Then she spoke, her voice a soft whisper that barely broke the silence. "They won't let me leave." The words sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, she lifted her hand and pointed out the window to the snow-covered forest beyond the village. And in that moment, the silence shattered. Whispers filled the air, hushed voices from every corner of the house, the sound of shuffling footsteps, and something moving down the stairs behind me. I turned, heart pounding, and saw shadows slipping through the walls, figures forming and fading in the frost. They were everywhere, people I couldn't fully see but could feel, their presence cold and unwelcoming. I backed away, heart hammering, but the girl's gaze held me in place. Her eyes were pleading now, and I could almost hear her voice in my mind, repeating, "They won't let me leave." Panic took over, and I ran, bolting down the stairs and out into the snow. The whispers followed, hissing and murmuring, like the wind itself had taken voice. As I ran, I looked back, and for a split second, I saw them standing in the village square, rows of ghostly figures, faces blurred, all watching me. When I finally made it back to the lodge, I slammed the door shut and didn't look back. The lodgekeeper took one look at my face and knew where I'd been. He didn't ask questions, just handed me a mug of something hot and let me sit in silence. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that village, or who or what that girl was. But I know one thing for certain: the Village of Silence is more than just an abandoned town. It's a place that holds onto its own, a prison of snow and silence, where the lost can never leave. And every winter, when the first snow falls, I still hear her voice in my dreams, whispering that same haunting phrase, "They won't let me leave." Since that day, I've tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, some twisted hallucination brought on by the cold and isolation. But every winter, something strange happens. As the snow begins to fall and the air turns icy, I'll catch glimpses of small footprints in the snow outside my window, leading nowhere. Once, in the quiet of dawn, I thought I saw a figure, a girl in a pale dress, standing just beyond the trees, watching. I blinked, and she was gone, but the chill lingered, crawling under my skin. And deep down, I know the Village of Silence hasn't forgotten me. It's waiting, patient as the snow, and one day, I might not be able to resist its call.